Here's what the headlines will not tell you. Nentawe Yilta, the APC's own national chairman, confirmed publicly that Siminalayi Fubara bought his nomination forms, appeared before the party's screening committee, passed that screening, and was cleared to contest the 2023 governorship race. Let that sit for a moment. The party cleared him, the party's own gate, and he walked through it. Then he withdrew. And the moment he did, Wike stepped in front of cameras and told journalists, "I wasn't surprised. In the first place, he ought not to have collected the form." Premium Times. So here is the question nobody is asking loudly enough. If Fubara was not supposed to collect that form, if there was a deal that barred him from even trying, then how did the party's own screening committee clear him? Who failed whom? And was Fubara's act of picking up that form, passing screening, and then withdrawing on his own terms a defeat? Or was it the most calculated political maneuver of his career? Stay with me, because what looks like a governor bowing out is actually something far more dangerous for the APC. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, welcome. Niger Inside Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. To understand what just happened, you need to understand what came before it, and I will keep this tight. On December 18, 2023, after months of escalating tension that included a fire at the River State House of Assembly complex, President Tinubu summoned the warring parties to the presidential villa. A formal 8-point resolution was signed. The terms were extraordinarily lopsided. Governor Fubara was required to withdraw all court cases relating to the crisis, represent the 2024 budget to the Wike-aligned assembly, reinstate the remunerations of all 27 defected lawmakers, and recognize Martin Amayebule as speaker. That was peace on Wike's terms, not reconciliation, surrender with conditions attached. Fubara survived 3 impeachment plots in total. Then, in March 2025, lawmakers led by Speaker Amayebule moved again. On March 18, 2025, President Tinubu declared a state of emergency, suspending Governor Fubara, Deputy Governor Ngoziodu, and the entire River State House of Assembly for 6 months. Fubara resumed office on September 18, 2025, following Tinubu's lifting of the emergency rule. Then, on December 9, 2025, he made the move that redrew the map, defecting from the PDP to the APC. Now, here is where the legal dimension enters. Wike has since stated that the peace arrangement required lawmakers to halt impeachment moves against Fubara on the explicit condition that the governor would not seek a second term. That agreement, however, was never codified in law, never filed in court, and never made part of any constitutional instrument. It was a political deal, verbal in its most consequential parts, brokered in the corridors of Asorok. Fubara exploited precisely that gap. He purchased his nomination form, he sat before the screening panel, he passed, and then, having proved that no legal mechanism existed to stop him, he stepped down voluntarily, on his own schedule, in his own words. The trigger event is not the withdrawal. The trigger event is what the withdrawal revealed. I will come back to what Fubara actually gained from this, because what looks like retreat may be the opening move of a longer game. The institution at the center of this story is the All Progressive Congress itself, and the question of whether its political party's internal agreements carry any enforceable weight. Let us be precise. The Nigerian Constitution does not recognize verbal peace deals brokered between a sitting president and a state governor as legally binding constraints on a governor's right to seek re-election. Section 182 of the 1999 Constitution, as amended, sets out the grounds for disqualification from gubernatorial office, and "you made a private arrangement with a minister" does not appear anywhere in that section. The APC national chairman confirmed that Fubara passed the party's own screening committee. The party's internal guidelines were applied. He was cleared. There was no constitutional or statutory instrument that could prevent his participation. This is the loophole, not a technicality, a structural gap at the heart of informal power sharing in Nigerian politics. Now, consider the Supreme Court dimension. In February and March 2025, the Apex Court delivered a series of rulings that effectively endorsed the pro-Wike lawmakers as the legitimate Rivers State House of Assembly, ordered Governor Fubara to represent the budget to them, barred the release of federal allocations to the state, and nullified the local government elections that Fubara had conducted. The judiciary validated Wike's institutional claims, and yet it could not, because it was never asked to, enforce the private political agreement about a second term. The Supreme Court is not a contract court for gentlemen's arrangements between political godfathers and their beneficiaries. That is the institutional breakdown. Wike built his position on judicial victories. Fubara tested the one wall those victories could not touch, his constitutional right to stand for election, and found it standing. Here is what makes this extraordinary. Fubara used the system's own rules to expose the limits of Wike's power, and he did it without filing a single lawsuit.
Now we arrive at the question this channel was built to answer. Who gains? Who loses? And what does this mean for 2027? Start with Fubara. On the surface, he lost. He withdrew from the governorship primaries, saying his decision was taken in the interest of peace, stability, and unity in the state. The man is not on the ballot. He will not be governor after 2027. By every conventional measure, that is a political defeat. But look at what he built in the process. Several analysts and activists pointed out that most governors on the APC platform were rewarded with automatic tickets, while Fubara was made a scapegoat, denied the same privilege despite publicly declaring support for President Tinubu's 2027 campaign. That grievance is now on the public record. It is a narrative, and in Nigerian politics, narrative is currency. By passing screening and then withdrawing on his own terms, Fubara did four things simultaneously. He demonstrated that no legal barrier existed to his candidacy. He forced Wike to publicly invoke a private deal, which exposed Wike as someone who operates outside formal institutions. He positioned himself as the man who chose peace over power, a posture with long-term appeal. And he left his political future deliberately ambiguous, because a governor who has not been impeached, not been convicted, and not been constitutionally barred remains a political actor. Now consider what Fubara did not sacrifice: his base. Fubara's loyalists rejected the APC House of Assembly screening report, labeling it a coordinated effort to dismantle the governor's legislative influence ahead of 2027. The disputed report allegedly disqualified aspirants believed to be loyal to Fubara while clearing candidates associated with Wike. His network did not collapse when he withdrew. It hardened. Now turn to Wike. Wike got what he wanted on paper. Fubara is not on the 2027 ticket. He endorsed Kingsley Chinda, the minority leader of the House of Representatives, as the APC's governorship candidate for Rivers State, describing him as qualified and politically capable. But here is the cost. Wike had to publicly admit that a private agreement, not a court order, not a constitutional provision, but a private arrangement was the instrument he used to remove a sitting governor from an election. That is not a demonstration of institutional strength. That is a confession that his power depends on deals, not systems. And which bloc is shifting? Watch the Rivers State grassroots. Of the 23 local government chairmen in Rivers State, 22 are believed to be loyal to Wike. That structural dominance is real. But structural dominance and public sympathy are different assets, and Fubara's managed withdrawal may have begun converting one into the other. Now the hardest question. What does this mean for President Tinubu? Tinubu brokered both the December 2023 settlement and the post-emergency restoration in 2025. He is the guarantor of both arrangements, and his guarantee just proved unenforceable, not through a court challenge, but through a political actor who followed every formal rule and simply walked through the door the rules left open. There is a question about Tinubu's position that this crisis has placed on the table, and we will come to it in the strategic outlook, because 2027 is not just about Rivers State.
Rivers State is not just any state. It is Nigeria's oil heartland. What happens in Port Harcourt reverberates in the national revenue account. The political crisis in Rivers State led to capital flight, weakened investor confidence, and widened the economic gap between rivers and more stable states. The emergency, including the suspension of Governor Fubara and the entire Rivers State House of Assembly, followed pipeline attacks that threatened Nigeria's oil lifeline. That crisis has not fully resolved. The pipeline security question did not disappear when the emergency lifted. It was managed, and management is not resolution. On federal-state power dynamics, what Fubara demonstrated is that a state governor operating within constitutional boundaries can resist the pressure of a federal minister, even one with the ear of the president, if that minister's leverage is informal rather than institutional. That is a signal every governor in Nigeria's southwest, southeast, and north will have read. For ordinary Nigerians in Rivers State, the fishing communities of the Delta Creeks, the market traders of Mile 1, the civil servants waiting on federal allocations, the arithmetic is straightforward. Political instability delays governance. Wike himself acknowledged the cost, noting that the crisis had led to capital flight and widened the economic gap between rivers and more stable states. Political actors rarely absorb those costs themselves. The people furthest from power absorb them. The security implications remain unresolved. Political uncertainty in an oil-producing state has historically correlated with increased militant activity. The incentive structure does not change simply because a primary has concluded. Consider this. Every episode of this crisis, from the first impeachment notice in October 2023 to this withdrawal in May 2026, has unfolded while oil prices remain volatile and Nigeria's fiscal position remains fragile. The timing of political instability in this state is never politically neutral.
Nigeria's internal politics have an external audience, and that audience is watching. Foreign direct investment in the Niger Delta has been structurally sensitive to governance signals since the militancy era of the 2000s. International oil companies operating in Rivers State do not need Wike versus Fubara explained to them in detail. What they read is, can the government of Rivers State sign a contract, enforce it, and ensure that the institutional framework around that contract is stable? This crisis, prolonged over nearly 3 years, has complicated that answer. For the African Union and ECOWAS, the Rivers State situation carries a more pointed lesson. The deployment of a state of emergency to suspend an elected governor and an entire state legislature, even temporarily, is an act that sits uncomfortably alongside the bloc's stated commitments to constitutional governance. Nigeria pressed for ECOWAS intervention against unconstitutional power changes in the Sahel. The optics of Tinubu suspending a state assembly while leading that pressure are not lost on African observers. For Nigerians in the diaspora, in London, Houston, Toronto, and Johannesburg, this story lands as a question about the durability of democratic institutions. Many of them left precisely because informal power arrangements repeatedly overrode formal ones. What they are watching now is whether that pattern is structural or correctable.
Let us still man the opposing view before we challenge it. The strongest argument in Wike's favor is this. Political agreements are the connective tissue of governance in a federal system as complex as Nigeria's.
No political settlement in Abuja, in Brussels, or in Washington is purely written into statute. The expectation that informal agreements will be honored is what makes elite bargaining possible. Without it, every peace deal becomes a starting gun for the next conflict. From that perspective, Fubara broke faith, not the law, but faith. And that distinction matters enormously in a system where institutional trust is already thin. That argument deserves respect. It is not wrong on its own terms. But here is the counter. An agreement that one party can invoke publicly and the other party cannot contest in court is not a peace agreement. It is a political instrument designed to bind one side while leaving the other free. The asymmetry of enforceability is not a design flaw, it is the design. And when a governor who has been suspended, impeached 3 times, and effectively blockaded, finds the only door left open to him and walks through it, that is not bad faith, that is constitutionalism. The misconception circulating most widely on social media is that Fubara surrendered. The record does not support that reading. Surrender is involuntary. What Fubara did was choose the terms and timing of his own exit, after clearing screening, after documenting that no legal barrier existed, and after forcing his political opponents to publicly acknowledge the deal that constrained him. That is not surrender. That is a managed retreat that doubles as a political indictment. What is being lost in the noise is this. The real story is not Fubara versus Wike. It is the question of what kind of federalism Nigeria is building. One where informal arrangements between powerful individuals determine who can and cannot stand for election, or one where the constitution is the ceiling and the floor. Now, if what you just heard challenges what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this, before we get to the part that reframes everything. Here is the 2027 problem this crisis has left at the door of the presidency. Tinubu enters the 2027 campaign cycle as the guarantor of a peace deal that proved unenforceable in its most critical provision. That does not destroy his candidacy, but it raises a structural question. If the president cannot secure compliance with a deal he personally brokered, what does that signal to other political actors calculating whether to align with or defect from the administration? The 3 most likely next moves, and at least one of them will surprise you. Move 1. Kingsley Chinda consolidates. Wike described Chinda as qualified and politically capable, noting that the APC's interest in him reflected his growing relevance. Chinda is the new face Wike needs, disciplined, legislature-tested, and untainted by the Fubara-Wike binary. Watch how quickly federal patronage flows towards his campaign structure. Move 2. Fubara's loyalists fight at the assembly level. The governorship race is settled, the state legislature race is not. Fubara's allies have vowed to challenge the APC screening outcomes through appropriate political and legal channels, arguing that the exercise undermines democratic participation. This is where his influence will either consolidate or evaporate. If his loyalists win enough assembly seats, he retains leverage. If they are swept out, his exit is complete. Move 3. Watch PDP's calculation. Fubara's exit from the APC ticket does not necessarily mean permanent residence in the APC. The PDP, which has been quiet through this crisis, has every incentive to open a channel. A governor who entered the APC under duress was denied a party ticket and oversaw Tinubu's declared majority in the APC presidential primary. That is a man with options. What signals should you watch? Watch whether Fubara is given any federal appointment or patronage role after his governorship ends. If yes, the deal holds and he is being compensated. If no, the relationship has broken down irrevocably. Watch whether Chinda's campaign receives direct presidential visits and endorsements before the 2027 election. That will tell you the depth of Tinubu's personal investment in Rivers' outcome. Watch whether Fubara makes any public statement before leaving office that signals his next alignment. A man who has operated this carefully for 3 years does not exit without planting a flag. The 12-month impact if the current trajectory holds: Chinda becomes APC's candidate for governor, Fubara leaves office in 2027, and the Wike political machine formally controls Rivers State's ruling party structure. That is a win for Wike on paper, but a political machine that operates primarily through exclusion rather than inclusion carries its own instabilities, and Rivers State has a long memory. The 3-year impact: everything depends on Tinubu's second-term calculus. A presidency that resolves crises through informal deals will face this same structural problem repeatedly in state after state as 2030 approaches.
We opened with a question. It is time to answer it. Did Fubara lose, or did he win? The honest answer is, he lost the office and he won the argument. He proved that in a constitutional democracy, a sitting governor with clean hands cannot be legally barred from seeking re-election by a verbal arrangement between powerful men in a presidential anteroom. He proved it not by going to court, but by passing the APC's own screening and then withdrawing on his own terms. The system's rules protected him. He used them, and then he left. His own statement said it plainly. Rivers State is bigger than any individual, and at this critical moment, the peace, stability, and unity of our dear state must precede every personal interest. Measured against the evidence, that statement is simultaneously true and strategically precise. It is the language of a man who knows that political capital stored in public goodwill outlasts political capital stored in office. For Wike, the victory is structural but fragile. For Tinubu, the question is now open in a way it was not before. Can informal deals substitute for institutional governance in a federal system of 200 million people? Nigeria's democratic trajectory runs through exactly this question, not in the abstract, but in the specific, measurable choices made in Rivers State over the next 18 months. Watch this space, because this story is not over. What we have not yet addressed is what happens when Chinda takes office and Fubara is no longer bound by any agreement at all. That is the conversation for the next video. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.